There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from spending your life performing for an audience. It never stops watching. You know the feeling, that subtle recalibration you do before speaking. The editing of your thoughts the careful curation of which parts of yourself you allow into the light. Most people believe this is simply politeness, maturity, or social intelligence. Carl Jung called it something else entirely. He called it a prison. Imagine for a moment that you are not one person, but two. There is the person you are when no one is watching. In those rare moments of complete solitude when your guard drops and your true preferences emerge. And then there is the person you become the moment you sense another's gaze, another's judgment, another's potential approval or rejection. For most of us, that second person has become so dominant, so constantly activated, that we've forgotten the first one even exists. We've worn the mask so long it's fused to our skin. Jung spent decades studying this phenomenon, not in laboratories or through surveys, but by listening to the confessions of hundreds of patients who sat across from him, successful by every external measure, yet hollow at their core. He noticed a pattern. The people most loved by others were often the ones most estranged from themselves. The most popular were frequently the most lost. Those who had mastered the art of being liked had somehow, in the process, lost the ability to know who they actually were beneath all that performance. He called this performed self the persona, borrowing from the Latin word for the masks worn by actors in ancient theater. But Jung's insight went deeper than simple metaphor. He recognized that the persona was unjust a mask you could remove at the end of the day. It was a psychological structure that, once built and reinforced over years, could completely eclipse your authentic nature. You don't just wear it. Eventually, if you're not careful, it wears you. Think about the last time someone asked you a simple question. What do you really want? Not what you should want, or what would make sense to want, or what others expect you to want. What do you actually want? If you felt even a flicker of uncertainty, a momentary blankness, you've encountered the edge of this trap, because the psychological mechanism of trying to be liked doesn't just modify your behavior. It modifies your ability to access your own desires, your own truth, your own inner voice. The trap is subtle because it doesn't announce itself as suffering. It arrives dressed as success. You become good at reading rooms, at knowing what to say, at being the version of yourself that others find acceptable, pleasant, admirable. You develop an almost supernatural ability to detect what others want from you and deliver it. And the world rewards this. You get the job, the relationship, the social capital. People describe you as nice, as easy to work with, as likable. But somewhere beneath all of that, something begins to starve. Jung observed that this starvation had nothing to do with external circumstances. He saw patients who had everything: wealth, status, loving families, public admiration, who came to him with a complaint they could barely articulate. They felt unreal. They felt like ghosts, haunting their own lives. They had succeeded at being who everyone wanted them to be, and in doing so, had lost all contact with who they actually were. The success itself had become the symptom. What makes this trap so insidious is that it operates through a mechanism we're taught to value: social adaptation. From childhood, we learn that certain parts of ourselves are acceptable and others are not. We learn that approval is safety, that rejection is danger, that being liked is survival. And in many contexts, this is true. A child who cannot adapt, who cannot read social cues, who insists on total authenticity regardless of context, will suffer real consequences. The persona develops as a protective structure, and initially, it serves us well. But Jung noticed something crucial about psychological structures. They don't know when to stop. A defense mechanism that begins as protection can metastasize into a prison. What starts as I should be polite in this situation becomes I should always prioritize others, comfort over my own truth. What begins as I'll adapt my communication style to be understood becomes I have no idea what I actually think until I've tested how others will respond to it. The persona, once established, has its own survival instinct. It doesn't want to be dismantled because it's convinced you that it is you. It whispers that without it, you'd be alone, rejected, abandoned. It tells you that your authentic self is too much, too little, too strange, too boring, too intense, too weak. It creates an elaborate story about why you must keep performing, keep editing, keep hiding. And the more you listen to it, the more you feed it, the stronger it becomes. Until one day you realized you've spent decades building and maintaining something that was never meant to be permanent. Here's the paradox. Jung identified the trap. Within the trap, the more you try to be liked, the less genuinely likable you become. Because what people actually respond to, what creates real connection, real magnetism, real presence, isn't your carefully constructed persona. It's the moments when something authentic breaks through. It's the flashes of real personality, real opinion, real feeling. The very thing you're hiding in order to be liked is the thing that would actually make you interesting. But by the time most people realize this, they're so deep in the trap that they can't remember how to be any other way. The performance has become automatic, unconscious, total. They've optimized themselves into a kind of acceptable blandness. They've sanded down every rough edge, every sharp opinion, every strange enthusiasm, until they've become a perfectly smooth stone that no one can hold on to. Jung's consulting room in Zurich became a confessional for a particular type of modern suffering. The people who found their way to him weren't struggling with poverty or obvious trauma. They were the successful ones, the adapted ones, the ones who had done everything right. They had built careers, maintained relationships, earned respect, yet they sat before him with a complaint that sounded absurd when spoken aloud. "I don't feel real." One patient, a successful businessman, described it like this. Every morning he woke up and put on not just his clothes, but an entire personality. He knew exactly how to behave in every situation. He could read what people wanted and become that. At work, he was confident and decisive. With his wife, he was attentive and agreeable. With his children, he was patient and playful. Everyone thought he was wonderful. And he felt like an actor who'd been on stage so long he'd forgotten there was supposed to be a life beyond the performance. Jung recognized this pattern because he'd lived it himself. In his autobiography, he described his own childhood split between what he called personality number one, the ordinary schoolboy who said and did the expected things, and personality number two, a deeper, older presence that observed life with a strange wisdom that didn't fit his age. Most of us learn to suppress that second personality entirely. We learn that it makes others uncomfortable, that it doesn't fit. That survival means becoming personality number one full-time. But here's what Jung discovered through his own crisis and through treating hundreds of others. That suppressed self doesn't disappear. It goes underground. And from underground, it begins to sabotage the very persona you've built to replace it. This is why people who seem to have everything suddenly fall apart. This is why the most successful often experience the most profound crises. The authentic self, denied and ignored, eventually rebels. The rebellion takes many forms. Sometimes it's depression, a flatness that descends over life because nothing feels real or meaningful anymore. Sometimes it's anxiety, a constant low-level panic that comes from living in permanent performance mode. Sometimes it's addiction, the desperate attempt to feel something, anything, that breaks through the numbness of constant self-monitoring. Sometimes it's inexplicable self-sabotage, the success you've built suddenly destroyed by choices that make no logical sense, unless you understand them as the authentic self's desperate attempt to break free. Jung watched this pattern repeat across different lives, different contexts, different backgrounds. The details changed, but the structure remained the same. Someone builds a life based on being who others need them to be. They succeed at this. The success reinforces the behavior. They become more skilled at reading others, at adapting, at performing, and then, usually in midlife, but sometimes earlier, something cracks. The structure that seems so solid reveals itself as hollow. What fascinated Jung was not just that this happened, but why. Why would the psyche sabotage its own success? Why would the unconscious mind actively work against the goals the conscious mind had set? His answer was radical, because the psyche has its own agenda, and that agenda is not social success or others' approval. Its agenda is wholeness, integration, becoming fully yourself. And if you've built your entire life around being someone else, even a successful someone else, your psyche will eventually revolt. Think about the physical sensation of holding something in, the effort required to maintain a smile when you're angry, to appear calm when you're terrified, to seem interested when you're bored. that muscular tension, that energetic cost. Now imagine maintaining that not for an hour but for years, decades, an entire lifetime. The exhaustion isn't just psychological, it's existential. You're spending all your energy being someone you're not, which means you have no energy left for discovering or becoming who you actually are. Jung noticed that his most socially successful patients often had the least developed inner lives. They could navigate any social situation with grace, but they had no idea what they thought about anything important. They could read others with precision, but they were completely illiterate when it came to reading themselves. They'd become experts in external adaptation at the cost of internal development. The trap operates through a kind of psychological economics. Every moment of your attention is finite. Every bit of your energy has to go somewhere. If you're constantly monitoring how others perceive you, adjusting your behavior to optimize for their approval, that's where your attention goes. You become exquisitely attuned to external signals and completely disconnected from internal ones. You know what others want, but you have no idea what you want. You can feel others' emotions, but you're numb to your own. This creates a strange dependency. Without others' reactions to tell you who you are, you feel lost. Alone in a room, you don't know how to be. You need the mirror of others' approval to feel real, to feel valuable, to feel like you exist. This is why some people become almost addicted to social interaction, to validation, to likes and comments, and approval, not because they're shallow, but because they've outsourced their entire sense of self to others' perceptions. Jung saw this pattern intensify in his own time, and he'd be horrified by its acceleration in ours. He watched as traditional structures of meaning, religion, community, ritual weakened, and people increasingly had to construct their own sense of identity. Without those external frameworks, many people turned to social approval as their primary reference point. If the church or tradition wouldn't tell them who to be, they'd let society, their peers, their social circle decide. But society is a terrible guide for individual development. Society needs you to be functional, productive, predictable. It needs you to play your role, follow the rules, not cause too much disruption. Your authentic self, on the other hand, might be none of those things. It might be strange, difficult, inconvenient. It might want things that don't fit into acceptable categories. It might have gifts that the current social structure has no place for. The people who came to Jung weren't failures. They were successes who'd succeeded at the wrong thing. They'd won a game that, once won, revealed itself as not worth playing. They'd climbed the ladder only to discover it was leaning against the wrong wall. And now they faced a terrible choice. Continue the performance and live with increasing deadness inside, or risk everything they'd built by finally asking who they actually were beneath a persona. This is where Jung's insight becomes almost unbearably relevant, because he recognized that the trap isn't solved by simply dropping the persona. You can't just stop caring what others think, refuse to adapt, insist on total authenticity in every moment. That's not integration. That's just a different kind of unconsciousness. The persona served a purpose. Social adaptation matters. The question isn't whether to have a persona, but whether you control it or it controls you. Jung's solution was more radical and more subtle than most people realize. He didn't advocate for abandoning the persona. He advocated for recognizing it. The trap isn't the mask itself. It's forgetting you're wearing one. It's the moment when the persona stops being a useful tool and becomes your entire identity. When you can no longer distinguish between who you are and who you're pretending to be. He introduced a concept that changed everything. The shadow. Well, the persona is everything you show to the world. Everything you've decided is acceptable and presentable. The shadow is everything you've rejected, denied, hidden away. It's not just the dark parts, though it includes those. It's every authentic aspect of yourself that doesn't fit the image you're trying to maintain. For someone trying to be liked, the shadow is enormous, because almost everything real has to be hidden to maintain the performance. Here's what makes this insight revolutionary. Jung argued that you can never be whole, never be psychologically healthy, never actually be yourself, without integrating the shadow. Not performing it, not acting it out unconsciously, but consciously acknowledging and integrating it. This means facing everything you've spent your life running from. The anger you've suppressed to seem pleasant, the desires you've denied to seem appropriate, the opinions you've hidden to seem agreeable, the whole messy, complicated, sometimes ugly truth of who you actually are. Most people resist this process with everything they have. Because integration means risk. It means the possibility of rejection, conflict, disapproval. It means potentially losing the very thing you've worked so hard to build, others' positive regard. And yet, Jung observed, again and again, that the people who took this risk, who slowly began letting their authentic selves emerge, didn't become less likable. They became more genuinely attractive. Not to everyone, that's crucial, but to the right people, to those who valued realness over performance. There's a strange mathematics at work here. When you try to be liked by everyone, you become interesting to no one. Your personality gets diluted into a kind of universal blandness. But when you risk being genuinely yourself, you become polarizing. Some people will actively dislike you, but others, the ones whose values and wavelength align with your authentic self, will be drawn to you with an intensity that the persona could never generate. You trade shallow approval from many for deep connection with few. Jung noticed this in his own life. As he aged and became more willing to express his actual thoughts, his stranger ideas, his genuine personality, he lost some admirers. The academic establishment turned on him. Some colleagues distanced themselves, but the people who remained, and the new people who found him, connected with something far more real. They weren't attracted to a carefully managed image. They were attracted to an actual human being. Complex, flawed, fascinating. This is where the trap finally reveals its deepest mechanism. It's not just about behavior. It's about what Jung called the abandonment of the self. When you spend your life trying to be liked, you make an unconscious trade. You exchange your actual self for an idealized version that you believe others will accept. And in doing so, you abandon the very thing that makes you valuable. Your unique, irreplaceable perspective and presence in the world. Jung saw this abandonment as a kind of soul loss. Ancient cultures had rituals for retrieving lost souls. Modern psychology, Jung argued, needed something similar. Because what was lost wasn't just happiness or peace of mind. It was the core self, the authentic personality, the individual essence that makes each person a unique manifestation of consciousness. When that gets sacrificed to the persona, something sacred is lost. The way back isn't simple or quick. It requires what Jung called individuation, the long, difficult process of becoming who you actually are. This isn't self-improvement in the usual sense. You're not trying to become better according to external standards. You're trying to become more thoroughly yourself, which might mean becoming stranger, more difficult, less universally acceptable. Individuation requires developing what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold opposing truths simultaneously. You have to maintain the persona, functional social adaptation, while also staying connected to the authentic self beneath it. You have to be able to navigate social reality while never forgetting it's a performance. You have to speak the language of your culture while maintaining your own internal dialect. This creates a kind of double consciousness. You're aware of playing a role, but you're not lost in it. You can adapt your behavior to context, but you never lose touch with what you actually think and feel. You can be polite without being fake. You can consider others' feelings without abandoning your own. You can function in society without society defining you. Most people never develop this capacity. They're either completely identified with the persona, lost in the performance, or they rebel against it entirely and become socially dysfunctional. Jung's path is narrow and difficult. It requires tremendous self-awareness, honesty, and courage. You have to be willing to see yourself clearly, including the parts you've spent your life avoiding. You have to be willing to feel the discomfort of being genuinely yourself, even when that self doesn't match what others want. But here's what Jung promised, and what he witnessed in those who undertook this work. On the other side of this process is a kind of freedom that people addicted to approval can barely imagine. It's the freedom of knowing who you are independent of others' opinions. The freedom of having preferences, boundaries, authentic desires. The freedom of real connection, because you're finally bringing your actual self to relationships instead of a carefully crafted imposter. The people who complete this process, to whatever degree completion is possible, become unmistakable. There's a quality about them, a solidity, a presence. They're not trying to manage your impression of them. They're not monitoring your reactions and adjusting accordingly. They're simply there, fully inhabiting themselves, and paradoxically, this makes them magnetic. Because in a world of performers, authenticity is the rarest and most valuable thing. There's a moment Jung described, though he never quite named it, that happens to everyone who's lived too long in a trap. It's 3 a.m, and you're alone, and the performance finally drops because there's no one to perform for. And in that silence, you meet yourself. Not the self you show others, not the curated version. The actual you, with all its strangeness and complication and contradiction. For some people, that meeting is terrifying. They've been running from that encounter their whole lives. They immediately reach for their phone, for distraction, for anything to avoid sitting with who they actually are when no one's watching. But for others, for those ready to see, it's the beginning of something else. It's the first honest moment they've had in years, maybe ever. Jung believed that every human being has a kind of destiny, not predetermined, but potential. It's the fullest expression of who you uniquely are, your particular constellation of gifts, wounds, perspectives, and possibilities. But you can only move toward that destiny if you know who you are. And you can know who you are if you've spent your entire life being who others need you to be. The trap of trying to be liked is ultimately the trap of never living your own life. You become a supporting character in everyone else's story. You develop exquisite skill at reading what others want and delivering it. But you never ask what you want. You never develop the muscle of wanting, of preferring, of choosing based on your own authentic internal compass rather than others' expectations. What Jung understood, and what makes his work so relevant now, is that this isn't a minor psychological problem. It's the central crisis of modern existence. We live in unprecedented freedom. Most of us are unbound by rigid social roles or economic necessity in the way our ancestors were. We have options, choices, possibilities, but that freedom is paralyzing when you don't know who you are. So instead of using freedom to discover and express your authentic self, use it to become better at performing for others. The question Jung would ask you, if he could, is simple but devastating. Who would you be if you stopped trying to be liked? Not in some rebellious, reactive way. Not by simply doing the opposite of what others want, but genuinely. If you quieted all the voices telling you who you should be, who would emerge? What would you want? What would you think? What would you create? Or love? Or pursue? Most people can't answer that question because they've never asked it. Or they've asked it, but immediately censor the answer because it didn't fit, didn't make sense, wouldn't be understood. But Jung would say that whatever emerges in that space, however strange or inconvenient, is more you than anything you've carefully constructed to win approval. The work of individuation, of becoming yourself, is the work of a lifetime. It's not something you complete or finish. It's a constant process of checking in with yourself, noticing when you're performing versus when you're present, distinguishing between necessary social adaptation and unnecessary self-abandonment. It requires developing what Jung called a relationship with the unconscious, learning to listen to dreams, symptoms, slips, everything your authentic self uses to communicate when it can't speak directly. This sounds abstract until you actually do it, until you notice that you automatically start to agree with someone and catch yourself mid-sentence, wondering what you actually think, until you feel the familiar urge to edit your truth to make it more palatable and choose just this once, not to. Until you set a boundary you've never set before and feel the terror and exhilaration of finally protecting your authentic needs instead of prioritizing others' comfort. These small moments of choosing yourself over approval, they don't feel revolutionary when you're in them. They feel awkward, uncomfortable, risky, but they accumulate. Each one is a small retrieval of your lost self. Each one builds the muscle of authenticity. Each one weakens the persona's grip just slightly. Jung noticed that people who did this work often experienced a paradox. As they became more genuinely themselves, more willing to risk disapproval, their lives often became more difficult in some ways. They lost relationships that were based on the persona rather than their authentic self. They faced conflict they'd previously avoided. But simultaneously, their lives became more meaningful, more vivid, more real. They traded comfort for aliveness. They traded universal approval for genuine connection. They traded the security of the known persona for the adventure of discovering who they actually were. In his later years, Jung wrote about something he called the afternoon of life. He noticed that the psychological tasks of youth, building a career, establishing relationships, finding your place in society, required a strong persona. But the tasks of the second half of life were completely different. They required letting that persona soften, allowing what had been hidden to emerge, integrating what had been rejected. The people who couldn't make this transition, who tried to maintain the same persona into old age, became increasingly hollow and desperate. But those who could let go, who could finally stop performing and start being, experienced something he called the treasure hard to attain. Not happiness in some simple sense, but a kind of wholeness, an integration of all the parts of themselves they'd spent a lifetime dividing. They became complex, complete, genuinely individual. They stopped being a type and became a person. The trap of trying to be liked is ultimately the trap of living someone else's life, even if that someone else is just a projection of what you imagine others want. It's the trap of spending your one brief existence maintaining an image rather than living a truth. It's the trap of reaching the end having been universally liked, but never actually known, including by yourself. Jung's invitation, and it's an invitation rather than a demand, is to risk something else. To risk the discomfort of being genuinely yourself. To risk the disapproval of those who preferred your persona. To risk discovering that you're stranger, more complicated, more difficult, and more interesting than you ever allowed yourself to be. Because here's what he promised, and what countless people who've walked this path have discovered. On the other side of that risk is your actual life, not the one you thought you should want. Not the one that would make sense to others, but the one that's genuinely yours. The one that, when you're alone at 3 a.m. with no one to perform for, feels real. If this opened your eyes, subscribe to Boring History, because the truth is never boring.